The Produce Safety Rule is one of 7 rules that make up the federal law known as the Food Safety Modernization Act. The Produce Safety Rule uses science-based minimum standard guidelines for the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce. The purpose of this video is to educate workers on produce farms with information based on the Produce Safety Alliance's Grower Training course covering the requirements of the Produce Safety Rule, and explains good agricultural practices or GAPs for on-farm food safety. This training will be split into 6 different modules and will cover the basics of worker health and hygiene and explain how those practices can extend to various farm aspects that include soil amendments, domesticated animals, wildlife, land conservation, production water, post-harvest water, and post-harvest handling. Throughout this training, a section symbol will appear when a requirement is specifically addressed. Also, for the purpose of this training, the term must indicates that an action has to be performed to be in compliance with the Produce Safety Rule. The term should, on the other hand, will be used when a specific activity is helpful to the workers but is not mandatory. Produce is associated with many foodborne illness outbreaks because it's typically eaten fresh, so it doesn't get an adequate kill step. Kill steps reduce human pathogens, microorganisms that could contaminate produce and cause illness in humans. Contamination can exist on the surface of produce, or it can enter the fruit or vegetable through stem scars or soft spots. It's important to remember that contamination can occur even if the produce isn't visibly dirty. The primary food safety risks that are addressed throughout this training and by the Produce Safety Rule regulations are those associated with human pathogens. They are the biggest food safety hazards in fresh produce. Chemical and physical hazards are also a concern, but because these hazards are less likely to occur, they will not be the main focus of this training. Human pathogens of concern in fresh produce fall into 3 different groups of microorganisms: bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Bacteria such as E. coli, Salmonella, and Listeria monocytogenes are microorganisms that can multiply inside and outside the host. Bacteria can multiply in as little as 20 minutes if conditions are ideal, if they have water, food, and proper temperatures. Their ability to multiply rapidly in a short amount of time is a concern because some bacteria can make people sick with a dose of 10 cells or less. Viruses, such as norovirus and hepatitis A, differ from bacteria in that they can only multiply inside a host. Despite this limitation, it's important to prevent viral contamination because it can only take a few virus particles to make a person ill. Viral contamination is most often linked to an ill worker handling produce or to contaminated water, which is why hand washing and illness reporting are critical food safety practices and will be discussed in depth in the subsequent module. Parasites such as Giardia, Cyclospora, and Cryptosporidium are protozoa or intestinal worms that can only multiply in a human or animal host, and they're not easily killed by chemical sanitizers. They're able to remain viable in the environment for a long period of time and are often transmitted through water contaminated with fecal matter. It's often difficult for humans to know when, where, or how they were infected with a parasite because the parasite can survive in the body for a long period of time without producing any symptoms. Furthermore, symptoms may also come and go, which can make it extremely difficult for doctors to diagnose parasitic infections. To best educate workers on how to minimize risks, each training module will follow a similar pattern and discuss how to assess risks associated with each topic. The various ways to implement food safety practices to address such risks, how to monitor the food safety practices, and what needs to be documented to verify that practices are being done properly and routinely. This module covered a lot of material, but overall, it's important that growers remember that produce safety impacts every farm, and that foodborne outbreaks impact more than just the consumer, but also the farm itself. Therefore, commitment to food safety is critical for the survival of the produce farm. Workers are essential to any farming operation, but they can also pose food safety risks. They can carry and spread pathogens on their hands, clothing, footwear, tools, equipment, or through illness and injury. To reduce these risks associated with workers, This module will help growers understand the requirements for an effective food safety training and what resources workers will need to perform their jobs successfully. Educating workers about food safety is necessary for growers to reduce risks on their farm. The principles of food hygiene and food safety are foundational for building a strong food safety program and reducing risk. This module will emphasize the need for workers to maintain adequate personal cleanliness, avoid contact with animals other than working animals, properly wash their hands, use gloves properly, remove any jewelry that cannot be easily cleaned and sanitized, and refraining from eating, chewing gum, or using tobacco products outside of approved areas. Personal cleanliness starts with wearing clean clothes and having shoes that can be easily cleaned and sanitized. If shoes cannot be cleaned or sanitized, then workers may want to have either shoe coverings or a designated pair of work shoes. It's important that workers especially pay attention to their clothes if they are working with animals prior to working in areas with produce or food contact surfaces. If a worker comes into contact with an animal that is shedding pathogens, usually through their feces, then this worker could spread those pathogens to produce. Therefore, if workers are working with animals and then with produce, they should either change clothes and shoes or wear coverings to prevent cross-contamination. In addition to the clothing workers wear, personal cleanliness extends to bathroom and hand washing facilities. While it's the farm's responsibility to provide the workers with adequate bathroom and hand washing facilities, it's the workers' responsibility to appropriately use those facilities. This means that all urination and defecation need to be done in the bathroom, and toilet paper must be flushed. It also means that workers must wash their hands after using the bathroom and should alert their supervisor if any of the necessary items, such as soap, toilet paper, or single-use towels, are not available. In addition to washing their hands after using the bathroom, workers must wash their hands before starting work, before putting on gloves, upon return to the workstation after breaks or other absences, as soon as practical after touching animals or animal waste, and after any time they suspect that their hands may have become contaminated. When they're washing their hands, workers must wet their hands, apply soap, and lather for at least 20 seconds before rinsing their hands and drying them with single-use towels, which are then disposed of in a waste bin. It's important that hand sanitizers are not used as a replacement for hand washing. Although hand washing is good for reducing the probability of contamination, some farms may choose to use gloves as an additional form of defense. However, these gloves must be kept intact and sanitary and should be replaced when they either break or there's evidence or suspicion that they may have become contaminated. Reporting sickness and injury is important because bodily fluids can spread pathogens to the produce or food contact surfaces. Any worker who is sick or has symptoms such as fever, coughing, sneezing, vomiting, or diarrhea, or is injured, must report themselves to their supervisor. Depending on the severity of sickness or injury, workers could potentially continue to work, but would have to be reassigned to a duty that does not have them working in an area with covered produce or food contact surfaces. If a worker's injured on the job, they must take care of the injury before cleaning and sanitizing the area that may have become contaminated and again, reporting it to their supervisor. To help prevent sickness or injuries, workers must have designated break areas away from covered activities where they can eat, chew gum, and use tobacco. Workers must also be supplied with water at all times. If workers do not have access to either a break area or water, they should report that to their supervisor. Lastly, workers should be aware that they have to be trained in food safety practices upon being hired, and at least once annually after that. While this training may have been a review for most workers, it's important that all the information is understood, as it is necessary to minimize food safety risks on the farm. Soil amendments are any chemical, biological, or physical materials purposefully added to the soil to improve plant growth. Soil amendments have the potential to carry and spread pathogens, but continue to be commonly used in the production of fresh fruits and vegetables because they can improve and support plant growth and development, while reducing soil erosion and sediment runoff. It's important to understand that all manure has the potential to carry and spread human pathogens regardless of the animal it's from. There are animals that are more likely to carry certain types of pathogens. For example, birds like chickens often shed Salmonella and Campylobacter, while ruminants like cows or sheep often shed toxigenic E. coli. But there are no animals that produce manure that has zero risk. Composting is one of the primary methods that are used to treat soil amendments. Composting is the process to produce stabilized compost in which organic materials are decomposed by the actions of microorganisms under certain conditions, usually thermophilic, for a designated period of time, for example 3 days, at a designated temperature, for example 131 Fahrenheit or 55 Celsius, followed by a curing stage under cooler conditions. The length of time will depend on the management parameters including aeration, turning, cover, feedstock makeup, moisture levels, and many other potential variables at the designated temperatures. It should be noted that if the treated soil amendment is mixed with raw manure or incompletely treated manure by accident or intentionally, or if the worker suspects the finished compost has become contaminated, then it should be handled as a raw, untreated soil amendment. To ensure that soil amendments are being composted properly, workers should comply with the procedures their supervisors must have in place to document the process. These procedures will include how to document all the process controls such as time, temperature, and turnings, in addition to any other steps the workers may have taken. This documentation is important because it verifies that a validated process has been followed correctly. When soil amendments of animal origin are not being used, they must be stored in a manner and location such that they do not become a potential source of contamination. To comply with this requirement, workers should keep finished compost piles covered and separated from raw manure piles, prevent domesticated animals and wildlife from contaminating the compost piles, and store soil amendments away from the produce growing and handling areas as well as high foot traffic areas. The application of soil amendments is not possible without using a variety of tools and equipment, which is why it is recommended to designate specific tools and equipment for handling soil amendments. By designating tools for this sole purpose, cross-contamination is less likely to occur. To also minimize contamination through these tools, workers must make sure that the tools and equipment are installed and maintained in a way that facilitates cleaning of the equipment and all adjacent spaces. The tools and equipment must also be stored and cleaned as frequently as necessary to protect from contamination of covered produce. Because workers who handle soil amendments are most likely working with fecal matter, it's imperative that they make sure their clothes, boots, and gloves are clean before working with produce. Workers must also make sure that they are washing their hands after handling soil amendments and any time that they suspect their hands may have become contaminated. By taking care to follow procedures regarding handling soil amendments and maintaining personal cleanliness, workers can help minimize food safety risk. Wildlife surrounds farms and cannot be controlled. Like humans, animals carry pathogens and can easily spread them through fecal matter. Therefore, workers must help in taking all measures to minimize food safety risks, which includes working to prevent animal intrusion into fields or areas with covered produce, assessing the produce prior to and throughout harvest to determine if it's safe for the supply chain, and washing their hands whenever they have handled animal feces or any time they suspect their hands may be contaminated. Workers must keep in mind that during this assessment, any produce that has evidence of fecal matter or has been dropped must be either thrown away or receive a kill step, such as heating or acidifying. To prevent wild animals from potentially contaminating covered crops, there are a variety of deterrents that farms can utilize, such as decoys, fencing and netting, relocation, tactile repellent, and noise and visual deterrents. The type of deterrent a farm may choose will depend on the type of animals they are exposed to. Workers must understand that the Produce Safety Rule follows the Endangered Species Act, which means that workers cannot harm or kill any animal that is listed as threatened or endangered. One way in which workers may want to prevent wild animals from coming into the crops is to destroy their habitat. However, this is not encouraged because it destroys natural resources and could lead to other types of food safety risks. For example, if workers were to dig up bushes and trees around the premises, then the crops are more likely to be exposed to soil runoff, which would contaminate the produce on a larger scale. Like wildlife, domesticated animals can also contaminate crops through their fecal matter. Therefore, workers should not be bringing their personal animals to the farm. If there are working animals, then workers need to follow the procedures their supervisors will have in place to know how to safely handle the animal waste. These procedures should include where and how the waste should be disposed of, what equipment or tools should be used, how those equipment or tools should be cleaned and sanitized, a reminder for employees to wash their hands, and directions for documenting any incidents. To make sure that produce is safe to be harvested and enter the food supply chain, workers need to know how to do a pre-harvest assessment. This assessment includes walking through the fields and looking for evidence of animal intrusion such as feces, tracks, or crop destruction. If a worker finds evidence of animal intrusion, then they should mark it off with a flag to signal to themselves and other workers that they should not pick from that area. The size of the area around the flag that is to be avoided will be determined by their supervisor. If during harvest a worker should drop a fruit or vegetable, then that product must not enter the supply chain. This requirement does not include fruits or vegetables that have to be intentionally dropped for harvest, such as some kinds of nuts or fruits. The worker's supervisor should also have a procedure that outlines in detail what the worker should do with the dropped produce and how to report the incident. This could include throwing it away in the trash or sending the produce to be processed with a kill step. Workers must wash their hands after handling dropped produce. During harvest, workers should also be assessing harvest bins and equipment to make sure that they have been properly cleaned and sanitized, are working properly, and will not contaminate the produce. If a worker suspects the harvest bins or equipment are contaminated, then they should report it to their supervisor and wash their hands. In conclusion, workers cannot control animals, but they can take measures not to harvest any contaminated produce and inspect their harvest bins and equipment to ensure that they will not be a source of contamination. These actions prior to harvest and at the time of harvest will minimize food safety risks and make it easier to prevent any contamination during post-harvest activities. Water is essential to the farming operation. Therefore, understanding how to manage water quality and its proper use on the farm is critical to reducing produce safety risk during the production of fruits and vegetables. Because there are so many different farming activities that use water, the Produce Safety Rule discusses water in two different contexts: production water and post-harvest water. This training module will only cover production water, and the following training module will only cover post-harvest water. Production water refers to any water being used prior to harvest or post-harvest activities that is directly applied to produce and has the potential to contaminate that produce. Examples of activities that would use production water are irrigation, fertigation, crop sprays, cooling, frost protection, or dust abatement. To minimize the risk of contamination from water during these types of activities, there are three aspects a worker should take into account: the water source, the application method, and the timing of the application. Production water primarily comes from 3 sources, with each source having a different level of risk for contamination. The first source is a public water supply, which is the least risky of the water sources because that water is treated and routinely monitored for any contamination. Groundwater or well water is the second source for water and has a greater probability of being contaminated than water from a public water supply because it's not treated. However, groundwater is filtered naturally by the soil, rock, and clay, and therefore the probability of contamination is low. The third water source that will be discussed is surface water, and examples of this type of water include rivers, streams, lakes, and any other water that is open to the environment. Surface water is assigned the highest level of risk because contamination can be easily introduced into it by a number of things, such as runoff from upstream livestock operations, wildlife, or wastewater discharge. Although workers do not determine what type of water source is used, they can minimize the likelihood of the water being contaminated by monitoring the connections to the water supplies, inspecting water wells to ensure they are in good condition and are properly capped and elevated, and assessing and addressing evidence of runoff, wildlife, or wastewater discharge. If a worker finds or suspects that the water source has been compromised and could be contaminated, they should immediately document the incident and contact their supervisor. Furthermore, if a farm is treating their water sources, then workers must be aware that all activities related to the treatment and monitoring must be recorded. In addition to the water source of production water, the application method and timing of that application can also impact the potential for contamination of produce. Primary ways that water is delivered to crops are through overhead irrigation, surface, flood, or furrow irrigation, and drip irrigation. Overhead irrigation is the most risky method because it allows water to directly come into contact with the edible portion of the crop. In contrast, drip irrigation is the least risky method because water does not come into direct contact with the edible portion of the crop, with the exception of root vegetables. Surface, flood, or furrow irrigation is also a good method because water is not intended to come in direct contact with the edible portion of the plant. However, there is a greater chance that the water can indirectly come into contact with the edible portion of the crop through splashes. To minimize food safety risks associated with the application method of water, workers need to be monitoring water lines to make sure they are not compromised in any way that would allow the water to become contaminated. Lastly, to minimize contamination from water, workers should adhere to the schedule that their supervisor sets for activities that involve water, such as irrigation. The timing of these applications is important because if done correctly, it can minimize the risk of spreading pathogens. If workers deviate from a set schedule, then there could possibly be an increased opportunity for pathogens to contaminate the produce. Therefore, workers should follow water application schedules closely and document when those activities are completed. In conclusion, water can introduce and spread pathogens to fresh fruits and vegetables, but workers can minimize this risk by being aware of where and how the water lines work and documenting any treatment or applications of the water. Post-harvest water includes any water that will come into contact with produce or a food contact surface and is used during and after harvest. Activities that use water post-harvest include rinsing and washing of produce or food contact surfaces, cooling, ice making, post-harvest fungicide and waxing, hand washing, and cleaning and sanitizing. Workers who use water during these post-harvest activities must understand that this water has to be safe and of adequate sanitary quality for its intended use and managed as necessary to maintain its safety. This module will focus on food safety practices workers can partake in to reduce the food safety risks associated with post-harvest water. Much like production water, post-harvest water does not have to be treated, but if a farm elects to treat the water, then the workers must monitor and document the treatment process. Workers must also ensure that any antimicrobial product that is used in the water must be labeled for use with fruits and vegetables. Most importantly, whenever using a labeled product, workers must follow the directions from the label and keep in mind that the label is the law. For farms that use batch water, such as in the case with dunk tanks, workers must change the water as scheduled by their supervisor or farm food safety manager, or whenever they suspect the water has become contaminated. To ensure the batch water is changed when necessary, workers must document this activity. Some factors that affect the quality of water include pH, temperature, and turbidity. pH is important for water quality because it can affect how well the sanitizers, especially chlorine, work. pH test strips are the most common way to understand the pH levels of the water, but some farms may decide to use an electric pH meter or titration method. Whatever method of pH testing is used, workers who are assigned to measuring the water's pH must be trained by their supervisor and document all pH results. In addition to pH, workers will also need to be trained in how to maintain, monitor, and document the temperature of the water. If the temperature of the water and the temperature of the produce vary too much, the effectiveness of the sanitizers can also be affected, and the produce is also at risk for taking up water, which would lead to a higher probability that it will become contaminated. Though pH and temperature are ways to monitor the quality of water, one of the easiest ways to know if water needs to be changed is based on its turbidity. Turbidity is the level of water cloudiness and can easily be seen by workers. Workers will receive additional training from their supervisors so that they can recognize the acceptable levels of turbidity and when the water should be changed. Alternatively, workers could be trained to measure and monitor turbidity using other non-visual methods, such as electronic turbidity methods or turbidity tubes equipped with a Secchi disc. Just like for pH and temperature, the monitoring process of turbidity must be documented to ensure that the water is being changed when necessary. Now that workers understand how to assess the quality of the water, workers need to know how to properly dispose of the wastewater. Methods for disposing of wastewater will vary from farm to farm, but no matter the method, workers must ensure that this water will not become a source of contamination to the produce, food contact surfaces, and other areas used for covered activities. This could include monitoring the drains and floors to make sure that there are no standing puddles of water, or ensuring that all catch basins, if the farm uses them, are not at risk for overfilling. In conclusion, workers can easily prevent a small contamination event from becoming a big one by monitoring the use of post-harvest water and its disposal. By looking at factors such as pH, temperature, and turbidity, and monitoring and documenting the appropriate tests for each one, workers will be able to fulfill their responsibility in minimizing food safety risks. There are post-harvest activities without water that can lead to food safety risks, which is why this module is dedicated to providing you with food safety practices to help minimize them. One such practice is to keep things clean, sanitized, and organized. By starting each day or shift with a clean, sanitized, and organized environment, it's less likely that contamination will be spread. Simple tasks such as assessing the building, packing and picking containers, packing equipment, transport vehicles, bathroom and hand washing facilities, and your own hands and clothes can go a long way. When assessing if these are adequate and safe for production, you should look for obvious signs of equipment damage, animal activity, feces, dirt, debris, and standing water. If you find evidence or suspect that any of the items listed above have become contaminated, then you are responsible for ensuring that it is properly cleaned and sanitized. If you find evidence or suspect the produce has become contaminated from fecal matter or has been dropped, then you must ensure that it is never harvested or distributed into the supply chain. Cleaning and sanitizing are critical to reducing food safety risks and preventing cross-contamination. Cleaning is the physical removal of dirt or soil from a surface, and may include the use of clean water and detergent. Sanitizing is the treatment of a clean surface to reduce or eliminate microorganisms. It's important to remember that cleaning must come first because you cannot sanitize a dirty surface. There are 4 steps to properly clean and sanitize surfaces and are as follows. The first step is to remove any obvious dirt or debris from the surface. The second step is to apply an appropriate detergent and scrub the surface. The third step is to rinse the surface with clean water, making sure to remove all the detergent and soil. The fourth and final step is to apply a sanitizer approved for use on food contact surfaces. Depending on the type of sanitizer, you may need to rinse it off or let it air dry. Remember that once you have cleaned and sanitized surfaces, you should document it. Because it is difficult to address all parts of the harvest and packing areas, it's important that you're able to prioritize surfaces that are more likely to lead to contamination of produce. The areas that you will want to focus most of your attention toward are categorized as Zone 1 and include all surfaces that directly contact fresh produce. These surfaces include, but are not limited to, harvest bins, workers' hands, conveyor belts, brushes, sorting tables, racks, and utensils. Once these areas are addressed, you can then direct your attention to Zone 2. These are the areas immediately adjacent to Zone 1, followed by Zone 3, which are areas adjacent to Zone 2, and lastly your effort should be directed to Zone 4, which include any areas outside of the packing or produce handling environment that could impact the safety of the produce. Another simple way to reduce food safety risks is to properly use your break areas. These areas must be designated by your supervisor and are in areas that are away from covered produce or covered activities. You must use these areas when you would like to eat, chew gum, or use tobacco. Remember that after you use these break areas, to clean up after yourself and to wash your hands before returning to work. This will help prevent any cross-contamination from occurring. By continually assessing your post-harvest environment and keeping it clean, sanitized, and organized, you will be able to further minimize food safety risks.